because Meghan and I love Susan Hussey. I think she's great. And I also know that what she meant, she never meant any harm at all. But the response from the British press and from people online because of the stories that they wrote was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous, the response.
And that fascinated me for a number of reasons, not least because I need a little bit of help understanding properly the difference between racism and unconscious bias. He has a crack at explaining it shortly. And secondly, because that was not in the script, was it? When we were reading about Susan Hussey and her comments to Ngozi Fulani, and everybody was taking a side, I think myself included, although I'm pretty sure at the time we talked about the difference between not knowing any better and deliberately setting out to be offensive, which is perhaps part of the distinction between racism and unconscious bias. But that there, we love her, he said. I mean, words at least as warm as any that came out of Kensington Palace or Buckingham Palace in defence of this woman. Interesting, really, to reflect upon how the issue of racism in the royal family has been kicked front and centre by Meghan and her husband. And yet on this particular flashpoint, no one ever thought to ask them what they thought. And now we know. Sympathetic towards Lady Susan Hussey, much more sympathetic towards Lady Susan Hussey than perhaps a lot of the commentary at the time allowed, although most of the newspapers were close to defending her. The idea that there is more nuance to these sort of issues than many of us allow in our binary footballified analyses really stopped me in my tracks. It really stopped me in my tracks. Because I sort of thought, well, what's the difference between unconscious bias and racism? And then I thought, well, I suppose the difference is that intent, isn't it? If you say something that upsets somebody else on grounds of their ethnicity, and then it is explained to you why that was upsetting, you have a choice, don't you? You either say, oh, God, that's so woke, or, oh, it's political correctness gone mad, or whatever the modern version of that sort of bigotry defence might be, or you go, oh, gosh, yeah, sorry, I won't do that again. I'm sorry. And that fascinated me because, oddly, given that the battle lines have been drawn up and that we're all supposed to be Team Harry or Team Charles or Team William or Team Camilla or whatever it might be, oddly, that was evidence of rapprochement or nuance or an attempt to come to a slightly better understanding of things. I thought that was incredible. I really did. That simple notion of him being the one to say, actually, this isn't a binary issue. We didn't accuse them of racism. The newspapers said that we'd accused them of racism. We shared a story that we believe displays unconscious bias. In its simplest terms, it's not a question you'd ask a white person, I mean, for the most obvious of reasons. And therefore, when you ask it as a white person, perhaps you're not being suitably conscious of how that particular question reaches the ears of a person of colour. And that's a bias. We are all biased in various ways. But when it's unconscious, you deserve, I think he is suggesting, more sympathy than when it's conscious. In fact, when it's conscious, I'm not sure you deserve any sympathy. So can we do that first today? Do you want to have a crack at explaining what the difference is between racism and unconscious bias? And then we will look at why. The questions about the darkness of the skin of their baby and Susan Hussey's questions about where Ngozi Fulani really came from are evidence of one, but not the other. But that's your entry point. What is the difference between racism and unconscious bias? Because surely, at least in one sense, they're the same thing. You're just being unconsciously racist as opposed to deliberately racist. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And if you want, it's depending entirely upon you. We may talk about what you made of the interview in general, but I find myself once again married to the idea that what you have to say is only really going to be interesting if your opinion is slightly different or profoundly different by the end of what you saw last night than it was at the beginning. If it's just enforced your affections or unpleasantnesses, your dislikes or your likes, I don't know how helpful it would have been. I'll tell you now, he was much cleverer than I realised, much more articulate than I thought he was. I was on Fleet Street when he was a kid and we were always hearing about how poor he was at school and how dreadful his exam results were, and you know, he made comments himself as well, didn't he, about not having read much Shakespeare. But in terms of articulacy and clarity, his use of language, I was actually impressed, if that doesn't sound condescending or patronising. I thought, crikey, I can see why he's confident doing these interviews. He's well more than up to the job. 10:17 is the time. Here you go. Here's an interesting question to start with from Emma in Wimbledon. Hello, James. If it wasn't such a serious issue as racism, why did Harry and Meghan bring up the comment of their son's skin in the Oprah interview? Well, I'll tell you, Emma, because unconscious bias is a really, really serious issue. In many ways, it's a more serious issue than racism, because overt racism is both easy to identify and easy to understand. But unconscious bias, where we are unwittingly, unintentionally offensive, is hugely important. I'm happy to explain that. I hope your question's not disingenuous, but I mean, that's why. And all the effort that the Daily Mail and others put into poo-pooing the idea of unconscious bias training looks even more ridiculous and sinister now than it did before. Who is most in need of unconscious bias training? People who suffer from it. Would Lady Susan Hussey have said what she said to Ngozi Fulani if she'd received it? No, she clearly wouldn't. Would that member of the family have been asking them in quite that way about the potential darkness of their baby's skin if they'd had unconscious bias training? I don't think so. I don't think so.